A short ringing rose from the silence and stretched higher and higher, as if the air itself had tensed. Pigeons fluttered on the rooftops, and banners fluttered in the narrow courtyards. The sound came from the bell tower at Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, and many thought it was the usual dawn call. But people with torches were already approaching the gates, and chalk marks were visible on some doors. Europe was still asleep, and Paris was slowly waking up to a night that would become a foreign memory and a foreign fear. Hello. Please write where you are watching this video from, as it is important for me to understand how far this story has spread. Leave it in the comments and enjoy listening. In the bookbinder's house on a narrow street, where the windows looked directly onto the neighbor's walls, a girl woke up. Her name was Anna. She deftly lit a fire to warm up yesterday's leftover soup and thought about her father returning from the embankment. He promised to buy fresh paper from the street vendors if they hadn't gone out of business. On the table lay a bag of thread and a thin needle. Next to it, an old knife for trimming edges. The house breathed its usual poverty. Clean, cramped, everything in plain sight. Each item in its place. At the opposite end of the block, a young man named Guillaume woke up in another house, a large stone building with a carved door. Inside, there was space and a cold floor. The servant left a doublet on a chair and a bowl of bread and a jug of water on the table. Guillaume studied in the house of his wealthy godfather, but his position hung by a thread. He was supposedly a nobleman, but a provincial one, with an empty purse and a family that preferred to remain silent. He had ink-stained fingernails and a stubbornness inherited from his mother, who once whispered to him that labor was not a disgrace, but a ladder. The morning was slow to arrive. Jean, a young boy, was wandering around the square near the church. He was known as an apprentice to a butcher whom no one respected. Too talkative, too thin, too pale. Jean carried water, cleaned knives, and lit fires under the pots for lard. They laughed at him and threw cigarette butts at him, which burned the vines. He swallowed his resentment silently and listened to the courtyards. He had a good ear. Sometimes he would stop at the towers where the bells hung and distinguish how the voice of the metal changed with the wind. As a child, he had helped a craftsman who repaired bells and learned to understand their behavior. It was his quiet knowledge, unnecessary to anyone until they asked, and they did ask. Paris lived half in wedding celebrations, half in anxiety. Very recently, two faiths had come together in one marriage, and the city breathed sometimes with hope, sometimes with anger. They said that the city was tired of loud words and no longer believed in smiles. Small marks appeared on the doors of some houses where people prayed in a new way. Not everyone paid attention. Some thought it was a game played by boys. Others thought it was an ancient sign of craftsmanship. In the dimly lit room of the workshop, Jacques, Anna's father, a bookbinder, was sorting through books. His fingers moved confidently along the spines, as if along a familiar road. Anna helped without asking unnecessary questions. She noticed a fresh chalk mark on the neighboring door. Jacques said that the janitor liked to make marks when he counted the windows to collect money for the roof, and waved it off. Anna thought about it and wiped the chalk with her hand. But the next morning, the mark reappeared, now with a dot next to it. She showed it to her father. Jacques looked gloomily at the white spot and said that someone was playing a bad joke. Nearby, in his godfather's house, Guillaume was copying Latin lines. An old priest, his godfather's uncle, entered the room and said that the night could be difficult, and that the bell did not always call people to prayer. He said he had heard words at the market. Someone was whispering about lists, about courtyards, about people with crossbows. He asked Guillaume not to leave the house. Guillaume nodded, but he had another thought in his head. Today, a new batch of paper was being distributed in the slums, on which Jacques' workshop depended. Without this paper, the bookbinder could not survive, and his godfather's debts to the people of this street were growing. Jean found himself holding something he had been avoiding. A package. It had been handed to him by a passer-by in a long cloak, who said it was for the bookbinder's house and that it contained only sewing cords. The package had a strange smell. Not leather, not resin, but a light sour lining, similar to vinegar rat bait. Jean carried the package through the narrow streets and noticed two people in identical raincoats walking ahead and putting chalk marks on doors. He remembered that the marks always appeared at night, but it was still daytime. He hid behind a barrel and saw one of them quickly touch the frame of Jacques' house. Jean changed his route. Anna met Jean at the entrance, took the package, thanked him, and put it on the table. Jean was about to leave, but noticed a narrow seam on the leather of the package. He remembered how the butcher hid pieces of bacon in the ashes so that the cats wouldn't steal them, and made the same kind of seam. Jean told Anna that it was better not to open the bundle without water nearby. Anna didn't understand, but brought a bucket. Jean cut the seam with a knife for trimming books. The leather opened, and out fell not strings, but two small clay jugs wrapped in thread. One had a thick neck and smelled sour. Jean recognized the mixture used to treat hides to repel parasites. In a cramped house, such a smell betrays the residents of the neighborhood to the whole street. The second jug was empty, but tiny metal grains glowed at the bottom. Jean told Anne that this was no joke. He said that someone wanted to mark the house with more than just chalk. He carefully pulled out the grains, rubbed them in his palm, and realized that they were shotgun pellets. He remembered voices at the market saying that there would be many hunters in the city that night. Anna turned pale. Jacques came in when he heard the noise and saw the contents of the bundle. He apologized to Jean for not immediately understanding the danger. He said the boy had done the right thing. Fear had entered their home, but with it came order. Jacques told his daughter to move the bookcase to cover the inner niche, which only two people knew about. He and the old midwife, who had been living on the outskirts for a long time. In the niche lay a small bag with letters tied with a blue ribbon and a small wooden board with a carved sign, half of a coat of arms, broken diagonally. Twilight came quickly. The evening bells began to ring a long note, but someone struck the metal differently, and the note became a command. Torches lit up the streets, and it was impossible to tell who was coming, the guards or other troops. Where there was chalk on the doors, there were shouts. The bell at Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois seemed to be keeping count. Jean moved toward the tower. His feet found their way through the familiar courtyards. He understood that if it was possible to warn the street in any way, it could only be with sound. He remembered the old bellmaster who had taught him that the ringing could be done in such a way that people would understand. Danger was near. Jean made his way to the service door and called out to a familiar guard. The guard was drunk and didn't quite understand what was going on, but he handed over a set of keys. Jean said that the bell had started ringing the wrong signal, and that the pattern of the chimes needed to be changed so that people would understand. Hide, don't run to the square. The guard waved his hand, and Jean climbed the stairs. At that moment, Guillaume, disobeying orders, was walking toward Jacques' house, clutching a bundle of paper to his chest. He had bought it secretly from people whom his godfather couldn't stand, but who knew how to get hold of rare items. Guillaume feared that if the bookbinder lost his paper, another honest house in the city would disappear, and with it, Anna, whom he had once seen in a bookstore and had kept at a distance in his mind ever since. He remembered the crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist. He had seen one like it on his mother's hand. He chalked it up to a trick of the eye, but the image lingered. Today, many things were at stake, and he wanted to repay a debt, an obscure but powerful one. At Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, Jean reached the bells and began to change the pattern of the chimes. He noticed how the air below stretched, how people began to close their shutters. But where chalk was already on the doors, something else was happening. Troops were selecting those who needed to be taken away and dragging them to the embankment. Around the corner from Jacques' house, people with bright armbands appeared, one carrying a hook used to open heavy shutters. Anna and her father managed to hide the letters and the board in a niche. Jacques told his daughter that if necessary, she should run to the midwife on the outskirts. She knew where to hide under the monastery kitchen. Anna asked why he had kept the letters for so many years. Jacques replied that they were words written by one person many years ago, and that these words would one day provide an answer. He did not have time to explain. There was a loud bang on the door. The boards groaned. Anna pressed herself against the wall, and Jacques picked up a heavy wooden press used for binding books. At that moment, Guillaume appeared in the corridor. He walked through the back door, which he had known since childhood when he was brought here for books. He put the bundle of paper on the table and said he had come to help. Jacques wanted to protest at the presence of a stranger at this hour, but he saw that Guillaume was wearing a rough work shirt under his doublet, the sleeves of which were splattered with ink. This was strange for a young man from a wealthy family. Guillaume confidently led Anna to a niche with a ladder. Old houses always have a passageway under the ceiling where grain was once stored. He said he had seen craftsmen hide children there during raids. Anna and Jacques climbed up and covered the hatch with a rug. People outside were breaking in. One said that bad guests had been seen here, another that there was a sign on the door, which meant the house was subject to inspection. They burst in, began turning over tables, taking books off the shelves, tearing out the spines. One poked a bundle of paper with the toe of his boot. The paper unfolded, and the sheets fell to the floor. Some of them had watermarks from the same courtyard where Guillaume's mother had once worked. One of the attackers noticed a seal on one of the sheets and recoiled. The seal belonged to the godfather's family, who had connections in the city council. He told the others that this might be a house where people were working who were not yet to be touched. They began to get confused in their own words, and this gave a moment of silence. Jean continued to strike the metal according to his design. He changed the pauses, adding a rare technique he had heard only from the old master. 2 short, 1 long, pause. Below, people stopped running toward the square and went in the opposite direction, toward the low shacks by the wall. There, in the narrow passages, it was easier to disappear. Jean saw the horseman rushing to find the source of the unusual ringing. He realized he had to leave. On his way down, he bumped into a man in a simple cloak, who was holding a bundle with a brown seal in his hands. The man said he had come to the tower to deliver a note to a servant, and that it was dangerous downstairs now. He said he was going to the monastery courtyard, where the bread ovens did not go out at night. Jean did not think much of it, but he remembered the man's face and the seal on the bundle. Half of the coat of arms was broken off the wax. In Jacques' house, the confusion gave way to a search. One of the attackers began to shout that he had once heard the godfather of a boy from this house say that the bookbinder had letters that someone did not like. He rummaged around the corners, but another man noticed the hatch under the carpet. He reached for it. But at that moment, Guillaume stepped forward and straightened his doublet so that everyone could see the patch sewn onto it. Not a coat of arms, but a small piece of fabric with the colors of the godfather's house. He said that work was being done in this house at his request, and that the mess here was a blow to those who were still able to arrange the paperwork for orders. His gesture was confident, his voice calm and explanatory. The attackers hesitated. They were told that these people understood orders with a coat of arms better than threats. They began to remove items with clear markings and left the rest. One, however, lifted the rug with his boot and almost found the hatch. But the noise from the street distracted him. Shouts and commands rang out. The squad left, promising to return. Night was falling. Knives began to flash in the narrow courtyards. Somewhere nearby, water spilled from a barrel, and the wind carried the smell of burnt resin. Anna and Jacques went downstairs. Guillaume, exhausted, sat down on the edge of the table. He took off his doublet. On his chest, Anna saw an old scar, a thin white line from his shoulder to his ribs. Anna had a crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist. She remembered how the midwife had once said that such marks were repeated in childbirth, and that the province loved the same signs. Jacques picked up a wooden board from the niche and examined the carved mark. He checked the notch at the edge and realized that the second half must be there. He looked at Guillaume and at the seal on the piece of paper. The seal had the same design, but complete. Jacques realized that all the pieces of an old story had come together in this room. Many years ago, before Anna was born, Jacques brought books to the house for a lady. She had a child by a man whose name could not be spoken aloud. The old midwife, the very same one, hid the child until the controversy died down and gave Jacques half of the coat of arms so that he could one day return it to the person who needed to know the truth. Jacques had remained silent all these years because the lady had disappeared, and the child, according to rumors, had ended up in the godfather's house as a distant relative. Now everything fell into place. Half of the coat of arms was with Jacques. The seal on the paper was with Guillaume. The crescent moon on the brush was with Anna. And the scar, which was talked about in the province as a mark of a child's fall at a stranger's door. Jacques realized that Anna and Guillaume were connected not only by the misfortune of that night. At that moment, there was a different knock at the door. A man in a simple cloak entered, the one Jean had seen on the tower. He placed a brown bundle on the table. He said he had come from the very lady who had disappeared many years ago. He said that the lady had died in a convent that winter, but had managed to pass on letters and instructions. If trouble started at the bookbinder's house, help was needed. The man did not give his name, but called himself a confidant from the convent bakery. He said he had enough connections to get several people through the courtyard to the furnaces and on to the docks, where barges carrying grain still moved at night. He opened the bundle. Inside were money, letters, and the second half of that very board with the coat of arms. The edges matched. It was a sign of kinship that had been whispered about for many years, but no one dared to name. Anna felt something fall into place. Jacques nodded. Guillaume pressed his lips together stubbornly, but accepted the fact. It was the first twist that did not come out of nowhere. Each of them had been shown their details in advance. The seal on the paper, half of the coat of arms, the midwife's words, the scar, and the birthmark. The messenger said the road would be short but risky, and told them to go now. He said the bell had given the people an unclear signal, and this had momentarily confused those in charge of the troops. He said they had to use this window of opportunity before everything returned to normal. Anna, Jacques, and Guillaume set off in pursuit. They walked along the walls, past doors marked with chalk. Anna memorized every sign. In one courtyard, she saw a basket of bread and a small bag of grain thrown on the threshold. She realized that simple things like bread and grain were becoming bait that night. They made it easy to identify the hungry, who were easier to break. It was a domestic horror. No knives, just bait and marks. The messenger quickened his pace. The monastery courtyard was warm from the stoves. Women kneaded dough without looking up. Seeing them, the messenger named the lady who had died in winter and quietly described the mark on half of the coat of arms. The eldest woman nodded and gave him the key to the side gate that led to the river. She said she had heard that tonight on the waterfront it was possible to hide under the salt barrels. She added quietly that the elder at the port was afraid to anger one house associated with the seal on the letters because they owed a debt for last year's flour. This was an unexpected benefactor who did not look like a wealthy hero. A simple woman, by the stove, whose power lay in bread and connections. She used her modest power to open the way. On the way to the gate, Jean appeared. He was barefoot, girded with a rope. He said that the hunters were coming here because they had understood the pattern of the bell and decided to secure the roads to the river. He said he knew another way, across the square near the bell workshop, then through a narrow passage behind the wine cellar. They listened to him with skepticism, because he was the very boy they had laughed at. But there was knowledge in his voice. He quickly pointed to the ledges, to the hidden gutter along the wall, where ash from the furnaces settled, and explained how to walk without leaving traces. He said the bell could be made to change its pattern again, to lead people to the other side. His plan was simple and clear. The elder woman, the messenger, Jacques, and even Guillaume understood that it was not high status that mattered now, but the ability to hear metal and know the courtyards. John, whom no one respected, became the leader at that moment. It was a hidden talent against status, and at the same time, the path of an underestimated hero. The boy from the butcher's shop became the man on whom the outcome depended. They were stopped by two armed men in the middle of the passage. They said they had seen suspicious people entering the courtyard. The messenger held out a bundle of letters and a seal. He said he was on a mission, and that these people were craftsmen, without whom there would be no decrees or accounts tomorrow. One of the armed men smiled and raised his torch, preparing to look at their faces. At that moment, a new series of blows rang out from the neighboring tower, not the one they were standing next to, but the one next to it. Jean ran up to the bell ringer's assistant and explained that he needed to repeat the pattern known in the city as "gather at the wall," adding two rare strikes that the old master called the false road. Below, the people rushed, not here, but toward the market. The armed men exchanged glances and ran to where the noise was louder. It was not a miracle, not a coincidence, but a precise calculation. The sound led the crowd. They came out to the side gate. The wind whispered by the water. Bundles of barrels lay on the pier. The messenger found a Baroque barge with grain, where the old miller's sign was visible on board. He said that the millers owed the godfather money, and that it was better to repay the debt quietly. There was room on the barge under a thick sail. Jacques said that Anna would go first, and he would follow her. Guillaume stood nearby, ready to push anyone away. At that moment, a man in a fine cloak appeared on the shore. He was accompanied by two others. He was one of those who liked to show his power without weapons. He said that he had seen this group at the monastery, and that he recognized half of the coat of arms. He said that many years ago, he was the very hand that flashed under someone else's window, and for which the midwife opened the door. He said he remembered the child who was placed in the basket, and that this child grew up in his godfather's house. His voice was even, but it betrayed a habit of giving orders. Guillaume realized that he was looking at a man from his mother's distant past. Anna saw a ring on this man's finger with an exact copy of the mark on the tablet. The messenger tensed. The older woman stepped back. The man in the fine cloak said that the debt must be repaid in full, not in halves. He took out a knife. He said that this city was built on obedience, and that a nameless son should not stand next to a craftswoman. He said that nights like this were necessary for everything to return to normal. Guillaume stepped forward and said that he had lived in houses where the habit of dividing people into higher and lower classes brought only emptiness. He said that on this night, everyone was responsible for themselves and those they led. He took a thick rope used to tie barrels and threw it at the man's knees. The man stumbled. The messenger cut the torch and threw the burning piece on the ground. The senior woman nodded to Jean. He struck the iron plate at the gate, and the sound went deep into the courtyard, where another squad stood, distracting them for a second. That second was enough for everyone to jump under the sail. The barge pushed off. People on the shore shouted something, but their voices were lost in the darkness. The water on the river was heavy and dark, but moving. Behind them, the city breathed fire and iron. Ahead was a wall of shadows. The night did not end. It simply changed form. It was crowded on the barge. Anna felt wood with her elbow, fabric with her shoulder, and Seine with her breath. Jacques held a bag of letters. Guillaume leaned against the side, guarding them, although he understood that if they decided to intercept them, steel would break any resistance. Jean sat at the very edge, listening to distant bells. He counted the strokes as one counts steps, and in this counting, there was an order that helped him not to go mad. The messenger told what no one knew for sure. He was a boy servant in the monastery bakery when a midwife brought a lady with a baby there. The lady said she had to hide while her fate was being decided. She left half of her coat of arms and a letter asking the bookbinder Jacques to keep the papers safe. Since then, the messenger had grown up and become a man with rare connections. He was not rich, but he knew where to go and whom to turn to. He said he did not consider himself a hero, but believed it was important to repay debts. There were no fancy words in his speech. He calmly explained how simple things, bread, ovens, keys, gates, kept the city going. Anna looked at the board with the assembled coat of arms. She was not thinking about the coat of arms, but about how she now heard her name differently. Jacques clutched the letters and thought about how old decisions return in a new day. Guillaume silently ran his fingers over the edge of the canvas, as one might run one's fingers over the edge of a page. He remembered his mother. She once told him that hard work and knowledge were his true shield, not someone else's coat of arms. He realized that it was time to make a choice not based on blood, but on what he knew how to do, and who he was ready to be responsible for. The barge was moving, but they were stopped at the bridge. People in dark cloaks asked why the cargo was being transported at night. The boatman said he was carrying grain for the monastery. One of the cloaked figures asked him to raise the sail. The boatman shrugged and held back his hand. Jean quietly suggested that there was a boat nearby with the same sail, which belonged to an honest fisherman, and that if they gave a signal by repairing the rope, the usual crack, the fishermen would understand and start arguing with the inspectors. It was an old trick. The noise of the arguing would distract attention from the right boat. The boatman seized on the idea. He began to pull on the rope, which deliberately snapped, the crack cutting through the air. An indignant cry rang out from the neighboring boat, and the fishermen began to argue with the inspectors, who were momentarily distracted. The grain barge passed under the bridge. It was a small victory of skill and hearing, not titles. At dawn, which brought no light because smoke hung over the river, they disembarked at the old warehouses. There were fewer people there. The messenger led them to the house of a woman he called Aunt Katya, the name of a rural widow who sold flour. She welcomed people without asking unnecessary questions. Her house was clean, and a bag of wheel repair tools hung on the wall. She brought warm soup and said they could stay in the barn until evening. She added that, if necessary, she could call the town clerk, who was loyal to those who worked with their hands. This intervention seemed simple, almost mundane, but it changed the situation. An unexpected benefactor, not noble, not armed, but the mistress of flour and a farmyard, opened her shelter and gave them time. She asked neither names nor faith. She only said that different people had passed by her, and that in difficult days, the main thing was to survive the night. They laid out their things in the barn. Jacques took out the letters. He had been afraid to open them all these years, and he was afraid now. But he understood that the truth had to work, not lie there like dead weight. He untied the blue ribbon. Inside was a story about how a child from the lady's house would one day learn who his father was. It said that his father was from the house, that he was now connected to his godfather, and that one day this connection would give him the opportunity not to be humiliated by those who liked to oppress others. The letters were not pompous. They were practical. They listed names, debts, agreements. Between the lines was a request. Don't raise your fists. Raise your papers. Guillaume suggested dividing the letters and making copies so that in case of a search, they wouldn't lose everything at once. Anna sat down at a low table and quickly found the right rhythm for her hand. She hadn't learned to write from her tutors, but she had always watched her father do it. Her lines were even. Jacques watched with pride. Jean sat by the door, listening to the courtyard. In the middle of the day, two people with city administration badges entered the house of the widow Katerina. They said they were conducting an inspection of the flour warehouses. At that time, it was quiet in the barn. Katerina greeted them reservedly and offered them bread. She said that the flour was marked with the seal of the millers, whom everyone knew, and that the invoices were with the clerk. She pointed to the bags with the correct markings, but at the same time began to place the jugs so as to cover the tracks leading to the barn. She spoke calmly, without raising her voice. The inspectors looked at the order and backed off. It was easier for them to search where there was dirt and noise. This was again a small intervention by a person without rank, but with influence. When the inspectors left, A man no one was expecting entered the barn, the one in the nice raincoat. He had been watching the barge from the shore. He walked through the yards and found the widow's house. He said he knew where the disobedient were hiding. He smiled without warmth. He said that everything could be resolved quickly if they gave him the letters, and acknowledged that the young man from his godfather's house had no right to any kinship or any sign. He explained that justice was an order that suited the powerful. There were 3 of them. One stood at the entrance to the barn. The second walked along the wall. They had sticks and short swords in their hands. Jean, who was sitting by the door, realized that talking was useless. He quietly got up and stood behind the one at the entrance. He remembered the butcher's yard, where every day he had to instantly assess the trajectory of the knife and the weight of the carcass. He caught the moment when the man loosened his grip slightly and pulled out the crossbar that held the bags in place. The crossbar fell and hit the legs of the 2 men. Flour rained down from above. No one could see anything in the cloud of white dust. Anna, who was sitting at the table, threw an empty bag on the floor. Jacques jerked the table onto its side. Guillaume, who lived in a house where rapiers were valued but did not train often himself, behaved not like a nobleman, but like a craftsman. He took a heavy press and aimed it at the stomach of one of the attackers. The man doubled over and fell. The messenger grabbed the knife that the man had dropped and threw it into the corner. The man in the fine cloak retreated into the shadows. He realized that he was losing his advantage in the cramped barn. He said he would leave and return with people who knew how to use fire, and that then nothing would remain of the barn. He added that the law was on his side because the law belongs to those in power. He said that this night would teach everyone to be silent. He left, leaving behind a threat. They understood that time was short. The messenger said that the letters had to be taken to the clerk that Katerina had mentioned. This clerk worked at the court, but he was not afraid to work with those whom others would not touch. He was a man of simple origins, who had risen thanks to his firm hand and memory for numbers. He was known for loving order in papers more than order in people. He was not a friend of Anna and Guillaume, but he could become the one who would put the truth on paper. The day dragged on like a rope. The city around them was in turmoil. By evening, things had calmed down a little. They made their way to the clerk's house through courtyards where washing boilers were smoking. On their way, they once again encountered people with chalk, making marks. Jean noticed that now there were small patterns appearing next to the chalk, as if someone was refining the list. He realized that the game had become more subtle. He said that now the marks distinguished those who knew how to read them, and that the danger had increased. He suggested wiping the chalk off with a wet rag instead of a palm, and sprinkling ashes nearby, so that the white markings would not reappear. Anna did this on 3 doors along the way. It was a small thing, but it gave a chance to those who would come later and see a clean door. The clerk's house was low and dark. He sat at a table with a quill pen in his hand and examined a small seal. He listened to them quickly, without pity or anger. He said that on such a day he could not defend anyone, but he could do what he knew how to do: draw up papers in such a way that they would be difficult to contest. He took the lady's letter, half of Jacques' coat of arms, and the seal from Guillaume's sheet of paper, put them together, and said he saw a match in the lines. He drew up a record, stating that the godfather's family had taken the child from the lady and recognized his right to protection from persecution until the end of the proceedings. He added that this did not grant wealth, but it did provide legal protection for those who decided to get too close. He said that copies would be kept by him and by the abbess of the Bread Monastery, whose name was known to the mother. He was dry, but honest. It was not romance, but order, built by hand. They left at dusk the next day. Paris was buzzing, but not as loudly. Fatigue weighed on everyone. Anna felt that the fear had not gone away, but a point of understanding had appeared in it. Jacques looked older. Jean was pale, but his eyes were burning. The messenger walked slightly behind, like a shadow, watching the side streets. They were met again by the man in the fine cloak, now supported by wealthier and better armed men. He said that the clerk's papers meant nothing when swords ruled the streets. He said that those who know how to put chalk down at the right time remain rich. He mockingly threw a bag of grain at Anna's feet, as if to remind her how the day had begun. He raised his hand, and the men behind him drew their knives. At that moment, a group of people carrying wooden sticks and torches came around the corner. They were furnace workers, millers, monastery servants, and several market guards who had not received orders during the night. Leading the group were the head baker's wife and the widow, Katerina. They said they had come not for the coats of arms, but to prevent this man from burning their barns and warehouses. They said that yesterday this man had tried to intimidate 2 widows and burn a cart with flour, and that this was not about faith, but about power over food. They did not shout, they simply stood as a wall. The man in the fine cloak did not expect the commoners to stand up so firmly. He counted and realized that he had less chance without making a fuss. He began to back away, but said he would return. He tried to leave with his head held high, maintaining an air of importance, and stumbled on the ash that John had scattered the day before at the turn. He fell, hit his temple on the edge of the barrel, and cried out. His men picked him up and took him away. It was not a bloody massacre. It was simply the result of haste and pride on a dirty street, ruled by ash. This was justice without spectacle. The man who had divided people in the morning slipped at the end of the day on the remains of the labor of those he despised. In the evening, they returned to the bookbinder's house. It was quiet there. 3 books lay on the table, which Anna had begun to rebound. Jacques sorted the remaining sheets. Guillaume brought the godfather's keys from home to a small storeroom offered as a temporary shelter for those in the public eye. He said that his godfather, upon learning of the scribe's letters, did not object. Everyone has their own calculations, but it is easier to side with paper than with brute force. He added that he was ready to return to the province to restart the workshop there under the protection of the monastic network. Anna nodded. She held her hand with the crescent moon up to the light and watched as the birthmark darkened in the dim light. She realized that now it was not only a sign of blood, but also a sign of choice, to be with those who do the work. Jean stood in the doorway. His shoulders were no longer hunched as before. He said that the people in the towers had asked who had changed the ringing, and that he had replied that it was an old exercise of the master. He added that he had been offered to become the bell ringer's apprentice and go to the tower not as a boy with water, but as someone who knew how to give the right signal. He smiled modestly. On that day, he became the one who would be listened to when iron spoke. The underestimated became indispensable. The night breathed differently. There was no more fresh chalk on the doors. Somewhere, houses were still burning, and many families were crying. But in this house, there was a different kind of heaviness, not from fear, but from responsibility. They had letters, seals, a plaque with a coat of arms, copies from the clerk. They had connections with ovens, millers, gates, and piers. These were not swords or spurs, but in those days they held their own, as well as steel. Several weeks passed. The city grew accustomed to the silence, in which you could hear the creaking of carts carrying flour and the dripping of water from barrels. Jacques began binding books again. Anna held her needle steady. Jean climbed the towers, his step confident. The elder woman brought bread to exchange for new records. Catherine sold flour and made sure that no one put chalk on her door at night. The messenger came and went, like a man without a home, but with roads. Guillaume began to accompany him. He carried bundles, helped the clerk sort papers, and taught the boys to make neat curls of letters at the master's workshop. One morning on the embankment, they saw that same man in a fine cloak. He walked slowly, a bandage on his temple. He did not look at them. He passed by, like someone who no longer commands, but does not yet understand why. The ring with the coat of arms on his finger was covered with a strip of cloth, as if he were hiding from the world the sign that had been his pride yesterday. It was a quiet denouement, not about revenge, but about how the city cuts away the excess when it finds a new order. That evening, Anna opened one of the books she had repaired. Inside was a note from the previous owner. He wrote that in times of great turmoil, people seek complex words, but it is their simple skills that save them. He wrote that a bell is not only the voice of heaven, but also the tool of a craftsman who knows how to change the pattern. He wrote that justice is not loud punishment, but a chain of small, correct actions that add up to results. Anna placed her palm on the page. She remembered the chalk on the doors, the package with a strange smell, the shotgun pellets at the bottom of the jug, the halves of the coat of arms, the woman by the stove, the scream by the bridge, the ashes at the turn. Each of these things was a warning that they noticed in time. That same evening, Jacques brought a small board with the assembled coat of arms to the table. He said that the wood could be left with them, but it could also be given to those who kept public records, so that the sign would not become a reason for new divisions. He said it was important that this sign was not a personal right, but a document that ended old feuds. Guillaume agreed. He said he wanted to stay in the city until the end of winter to finish his business with the clerk and the monastery bakery. He said that then he would leave for the province and maybe return. He spoke calmly, without making any promises. Jean stood in the doorway and listened. The evening chime was simple, without any tricks. He smiled because he understood. Sometimes it is better when the sound speaks ordinary words. But he knew that when night came again, his ears and hands would be ready. The next day, the women at the oven gave out bread at a lower price. They said it was in memory of those who had not returned. They did not say lofty words. They just made bread. Katerina measured out the flour with long, steady movements, which calmed those standing in line. The clerk passing by nodded like a man who understands that order is maintained by such movements more than by seals. Months passed. Anna sometimes took orders from students who brought in old notebooks. She did not tell them the story of that night in detail. She simply showed them how to hold the needle, how to mark the paper so as not to damage the spine, how to dry the sheets so that they would not warp. She said that precision was more important than strength. Her words were based on experience, not heroism. Meanwhile, Guillaume received a letter from his godfather. He wrote that he was ready to settle the dispute over old debts if Guillaume continued to work with the scribe and kept the monastery's papers in order. It was a recognition not of blood ties, but of the value of work. Guillaume took this as a good sign. He understood that sometimes justice does not come in the form of a loud decision, but in the form of an honest task that gives space to those who are capable. Jean began to teach the two boys in the tower. He told them that the bell was not a toy, that they had to know the patterns of the chimes as well as they knew the streets. He explained that the sound could confuse evil if it was made at the right time and in the right way. He told them this without shouting, simply as a master. He became someone who was listened to, not out of fear, but because there was no emptiness in his words. One night, Anna, returning from the ovens, saw a faint chalk line at the edge of the square. Someone's hand had drawn the sign out of habit. She walked over and wiped the line away with a wet rag. She sprinkled ashes on top. She didn't argue or shout. She just removed the danger. It was a simple gesture, but it was gestures like this that saved lives. That was the end of their part of the story. On that terrible St. Bartholomew's Day night of August 24th, 1572, the bell did indeed become a signal, but not only for disaster. It became a way to warn, deceive, and survive. The chalk on the doors became a sign that could be erased not with a hand, but with knowledge. The parcel turned out to be a trap, but it was exposed through experience. The coat of arms became not a sword of division, but a knot that was untied and given to the letters for safekeeping. The unexpected benefactor did not come on horseback, but from the bakery, where the flames of the ovens burn quietly. Hidden talent versus status showed that hearing metal is more important than wearing silk. The underestimated boy turned out to be the one who changes the course of the night. And final justice did not come from a high pulpit. It happened where people brought each other bread, opened the gate, made a record with the clerk, changed the pattern of the bell's chime, and carefully sewed the spine of a torn book. And every choice was simple and precise, as it should be in a city that has survived the night and wants to live on.